Hello again, 2020 students. This is part 2 of the video. There was a bit of a technical glitch in the first one, so started the second half. Not much more content to go over here, just wanted to clarify a couple of ideas. The first is that the world around us, according to Plato, is a flawed copy of these ideals. And that idea of this being a flaw or a mistake or something that's less than perfect is very important to understanding how Eros is pushing the lover towards some sort of perfection. The intellect itself being divided between reason and understanding is a little bit too much in the weeds, I think, for us to understand Socrates. What they are engaged in is less than a dialectic anyway. It is an unusual text, what you're reading, the Symposium, in that many and most of Plato's other works are actually conversations, recorded conversations between characters, instead of having these individual speeches which follow one after the other. So that makes this text unusual, and it makes this idea of the dialectic, an idea of having a conversation and achieving reason, a little bit less important to what we're reading. I would recommend, to summarize some of these ideas about the ideal, that you check out what's called the Allegory of the Cave. It is a section of a larger book by Plato called The Republic. And it's oftentimes found by itself, so you should be able to find online either a copy to read, or there's a couple of videos that demonstrate it as well. Some of those videos are very much politically oriented, trying to get you to think that, kind of the government is lying to you or some sort of craziness like that, which, maybe the government is lying, but it gets a little off, goes a little overboard sometimes. So don't take it like that, because Socrates is not talking about politics. Socrates is talking about the soul, or the spirit, or the mind, and how it is led astray by the world around us, and how other people being led astray to interact with this sensible world are actually leading others astray at the same time. And it's up to this massive effort by the philosopher to break away from these chains, as he describes them literally, and to escape into a realm where he can see the perfect beauty and goodness, and then try to return to that cave to convince other people that there is a better world, more of a perfect world out there. So in the end, there is a bit of a political seeming message component to it that you can explore. But anyone who uses the allegory of the cave to try to convince you that what Socrates was really talking about is how governments lie to people, is really not very intelligent, because they don't really understand what Socrates is talking about and what Plato is after. Doesn't mean that what they are saying is not necessarily true. It just means that they're, not that intelligent. So be that as it may, some of the videos may try to explain it. Best to find, there's an animated video that's has actually Orson Welles narrating the thing, which is old, from the 1960s, I think, but pretty interesting in that it kind of describes what you have to remember is a spiritual question, and not not necessarily straightforwardly a political question. But it does give you a little bit more context about what is it that Socrates is trying to say. So, some general notes, as I have here very broadly written, more notes, this lecture, by the way, is in Top Hat, so you can find these lecture slides there. And I'll allow you to read this. This is, pretty straightforward out of the text. Eros has, as I have here, a direction, and I've mentioned already, actually, in the previous video, a direction toward beauty, and that Diotima asks Socrates about this permanent possession idea. What is it that we really want? And Socrates offers that we want to permanently possess goodness. And that's what leads us towards some of these very important concepts like immortality and the good. So the purpose of Eros, according to Diotima, is to possess the good. Eros is seeking to possess the good, and we are sort of like partners. She doesn't really describe very well how Eros moves us. It almost seems as though we are supposed to be moved by seeing Eros, or seeing how Eros goes about doing things, which would imply that Socrates is creating a world or a point of view where Eros is like a philosopher, in that we read the philosopher and we follow the philosopher's ways in order to achieve some better world or some goodness. And that seems to be the way Diotima describes Eros as working. As Socrates points out, this possession implies the permanent possession of goodness, which, as Diotima points out, can only be achieved if one is immortal. So the search for goodness is also at the same time a search for immortality. Now, Eros doesn't have to worry about that because Eros is immortal. Human beings have to worry about that because obviously human beings are not immortal, which allows for her, or doesn't, I shouldn't say allows, it creates a conundrum for her. If there are, two types of Eros, or two sort of purposes of Eros, the search for permanent possession of goodness and the search for immortality, which are correlated, sort of. What she does is effectively say that the idea of a common love, as we saw in Pausanias and in Eryximachus, isn't necessarily a negative thing at all. It is a drive to achieve immortality in a physical world. So we pass on our genes to our children. We pass on our ideas, our traditions. We pass on the memory of ourselves. And that memory lives in our children and helps us achieve something approaching immortality in the Greek concept of that word. So, what do we do for those who are not seeking to have children? It seems as though she's produced with her division here an attempt to achieve immortality and an attempt to achieve goodness and immortality. And that's where she turns towards the male lovers. Something approximating this pederastic relationship, except that this ladder of love idea comes about where the lover finds a beautiful, as she says, a beautiful boy, and then realizes that that beauty is not permanent. It is not the permanent possession of goodness, and slowly works his way up a ladder to achieve a better view of that perfect beauty and that goodness. Along the way, there's also what she calls this mental pregnancy. So there is a way of achieving an immortality from that philosopher who doesn't have a lot of children. Or Socrates had children, so even a philosopher who has physical children. There is a way of achieving that mental immortality by passing along or birthing in someone ideas of virtue and goodness. So the permanent possession means a type of procreation, identical in its purpose, but different in its approach and different in its outcome, you could say, to that of physical love. So some questions that you should consider, and that was definitely not a comprehensive view of the text. You want to read it more deeply, and get some of those quotes that are important and find those contradictions, etc. But some questions for you to think about, especially if you're sitting down writing essays and or just thinking about the quiz, etc., are these questions. Generally speaking, is this a realistic concept of love? What about emotions? He doesn't really bring up emotion at all. Infatuation, that's not really there in Socrates' description. There also, you could say, some speeches that deal with social aspects and some with metaphysical. So if you really thought about it, Socrates' approach to love is sort of sociopathic. It wouldn't necessarily build a strong society if everyone wandered around trying to, falling in love with one man and then falling in love with many men and then falling in love with humanity and sort of ascending this ladder of love. If everyone did that, you wouldn't have crops being brought in out of the field. So it definitely seems like it's an approach that is oriented towards the philosopher. But there are others who deal with those specific good social outcomes, like Phaedrus, Pausanias to some extent. So that's another way of dividing up the text to try to understand it more. Another very, very important component that I haven't gotten to, and I'm interested to see if you want to tackle it, is this question of Alcibiades. Alcibiades finishes the book. And if we, as I have here, are supposed to be reading this book in order to get the wisdom of Socrates, why is it that Alcibiades is the last speech? Now there is the sense that his speech really clarifies to the reader that Socrates himself seems to be living by his ideas. He's not engaging in physical relationships. But Alcibiades is also overcome with jealousy, that emotion. And at the end of the series of speeches, one of the last images we have is Socrates still sitting down really, really close to Agathon, who Alcibiades points out is the most attractive man at the Symposium, and is talking to him well into the early morning hours, almost reinforcing this idea that Socrates is still physically interested in other men, attractive young men. So it leaves us with that conundrum about how are we supposed to deal with those contradictions. So I'm not going to answer those questions for you because there's not really any right answer. I am curious to see what bubbles up in discussions and your quiz and in writing your essays. So I hope this has been helpful. I will try to do this for every single one of the texts that we have. We'll certainly do this for Ovid. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to email me, send me a message in Canvas, or pick up the phone, or, well, you don't have I'm not in my office, so the easiest thing to do is to set up an office hour meeting with me. I'd be happy to chat with you more about any of this. I hope you enjoy your reading. Bye-bye.